All right, so today we'll be learning about the gymnosperms. The gymnosperms are the naked seed plants. The name gymno, that's the same root as like gymnasium, comes from a Greek root, gymnos, which means um, naked, and that's where we get gymnasium because the ancient Greeks used to practice sports and train for the original Olympic Games in the nude. Sperm is a Greek root which means seed. So literally, gymnosperms means naked seed plants. And these are some of the very first seed plants to evolve, and we'll be exploring today their some of their adaptations that have allowed them to be so successful. So gymnosperms and the naked seed plants, they have been around on Earth for over 350 million years. These are among the first seed plants to evolve, and because they have such a long evolutionary history on Earth, they have diversified over time into many groups. Like all plants, gymnosperms exhibit an alternation of generations. They have a sporophyte or spore plant generation, and they have a gametophyte or gamete plant generation. In conifers, unlike some of the previous um, earlier plants like ferns, the sporophyte phase is dominant, and the gametophyte is actually dependent on the sporophyte. Um, I say here, unlike most earlier plants, gymnosperms produce two types of spores: microspores and megaspores. Um, the reason I say unlike most earlier plants is because there are some earlier plants like the lycophytes that do also produce microspores and megaspores, but they don't yet produce seeds. As we go throughout this lecture, I want you to think of micro as meaning male and mega as meaning female. Microspores, those would be male spores, and they're small. Micro means small, right? Whereas mega means large. Those would be female spores. We're going to see microspores, microgametophyte, um, microsporophyll. We'll see all these words with micro in them. That just means small or male reproductive structures. We're going to see words like megaspore, megagametophyte, megastrobilus. Those are all large female reproductive structures. So, one thing that's a little unique about the seed plants is that unlike all of our previous kind of earlier plant groups, the spore plants like ferns or the mosses and liverworts, is that seed plants actually germinate their spores while they are still attached to the parent sporophyte. So if we look at this diagram, we see our mature sporophyte is a pine tree, and the spores are produced by the sporophyte, the mature tree, but those spores germinate while still attached. Those spores then produce gametes that produce eggs and sperm, and they will basically mate with each other while, um, in the case of the egg, while the egg is still attached to the parent, um, and then produce seeds. Okay. So the microspores, they germinate and develop into a male microgametophyte. Okay. A microgametophyte would be a small male gametophyte plant. Okay, the pollen is actually a tiny little male plant and it produces sperm. It is not plant sperm itself. Um, and the kind of magical thing that gymnosperms accomplished was pollen and pollination. So by producing pollen, the gymnosperms were the first plants that were able to sexually reproduce under dry conditions. The pollen grains have a tough, sometimes watertight covering that protects the pollen grain and allows plants that are separated by long distances to sexually reproduce with each other, even when there's no moisture for sperm to swim. Most of the earlier plants have swimming sperm, and that would require there to be free moisture on the surfaces um, that would be that the sperm would have to swim through in order to get the sperm to the egg. Megaspores are the female spores. Those germinate while still attached to this parent sporophyte, and they develop into the female megagametophyte, or the ovule, while they're still attached to the parent. Okay, and the big advantage of these megaspores and that conifers produce, not conifers, but gymnosperms produce, is if you have a larger female spore, um, and a larger female gametophyte or megagametophyte, that allows our gymnosperms to store food for the new embryo and also to protect it with a hard seed coat. Both of those things are not possible with spores which are released by the sporophyte. Um, Ferns produce spores which are just released from the sporophyte, and if they don't land in just the right environment, um, they won't germinate and produce a new gametophyte. So um, basically, by highly reducing the gametophyte stage, the sporophytes of gymnosperms are able to they're able to produce their gametophytes on their actual body. Those gametophytes are able to then mate and produce a new sporophyte embryo. Okay. Um, When we look at gymnosperm cones, we have two different types. And remember that mega is essentially going to mean female and micro is essentially going to mean male. So the megastrobili are the female or ovulate cones, and they're what we typically think of when we see a conifer cone. These are woody modified shoots. They've got thick modified megasporophylls. Those are large spore bearing leaves, and they produce ovules. And after pollination, those ovules mature into seeds. Um, Gymnosperms also produce another type of cone, which many of us may not have noticed before. Those are the microstrobili, or the male or pollen cones. These are soft modified shoots, and they produce thin, papery microsporophylls, or male spore-producing leaves, which deteriorate after shedding their pollen. So if we look at the top picture on this slide, we can see a megastrobilus. Strobilus is the singular of strobili, which is the plural. So we see a megastrobilus, which is the female cone, which is large and woody, and then we see a cluster of microstrobili, which are the soft male cones, and they're shed right after they release their pollen. If we look at the bottom images, we can see a cluster of microstrobili that have actually already shed their pollen and are shriveled. And we can also see a developing megastrobilus that's still green and has not yet dried out and opened up to release its seeds. Gymnosperms were originally wind pollinated. One of the peculiarities of the conifers is that they evolved before a lot of our groups of modern insects existed. We did have some precursors of insects like dragonflies that existed at the time when gymnosperms were first evolving, but insect groups like the bees and wasps and butterflies and moths and beetles had not yet evolved. So insect pollination wasn't really an option during the early history of the evolution of this group. The pollen, which are just highly reduced male gametophytes that produce sperm to mate with the female gametophyte to make a new sporophyll baby. They're highly reduced and they've got some protective coverings on them, and that was a major evolutionary innovation because it allowed for pollination. And the combination of producing pollen and relying on pollination to exchange sexual genetic information between individual plants allowed the gymnosperms to perform sexual reproduction without the necessity for free liquid water through which sperm could swim. Now, a sperm grain could land on a receptive female cone and result in pollination. There didn't need to be any additional moisture provided. Conifers, which are among the first gymnosperms to evolve, they still do pollination this way. They still produce male microstrobili and female megastrobili. They release their pollen typically in the spring. The immature female cones are pollinated, and then over the course of the next year, those cones mature and eventually split open to release their seeds. We'll look at how that process occurs as we move forward. So when we look at the pollination of gymnosperms, we've already established that the male microstrobili release pollen, which is the male gametophyte. We haven't talked very much about the female gametophyte yet. So the female gametophytes are contained within the female cones, or the megastrobilus. So the first thing that has to happen is our immature megastrobilus, or female cone, develops with its scales closed. And that's, I presume, mostly to protect the developing ovules underneath. But yeah, they develop with their scales typically closed. Once the megastrobilus, or the female cone, is mature enough for pollination to occur, the scales of the megastrobilus open and they allow pollen to enter the space between the scales where the ovules sit. After pollination has occurred, the scales will then reclose. If the female cone is not successfully pollinated, then it will be shed. If they are pollinated successfully, the pollinated female cone, or megastrobilus, will remain closed and will enlarge as fertilization occurs and as those seeds begin to develop. And eventually that mature female cone will become woody, it'll dry out, and it will open to release mature developed seeds. When we look at this panel of images, I'd like to direct your attention to the series of images on the right-hand side. We can see at the top a pre-pollination cone with the closed scales. Then if we look at the next slide down, image D, we see that the scales of that cone have now peeled back to allow pollen in. And then in picture F, they've kind of folded back, closed again to protect those developing seeds. One of the things that's a little bit unusual about the development of cones is that it takes cones typically about 2 years to be mature enough to release their seeds. During the first year, that female cone is kind of growing and developing. It's tiny and usually pretty soft. Eventually it opens up, it's pollinated, and those ovules are fertilized and begin to develop into seeds. During the second year, that megastrobilus is going to increase in size, the seeds are going to mature, and eventually it is going to dry out and open. It's going to release typically 2 seeds from the tops of each scale. Certainly that's true of most conifers. And in a lot of pines, these seeds actually have little wings on them. You can see the winged seeds in this phenological panel, which is the top image. And those winged seeds are going to be able to flutter away in the wind to disperse the seeds of that pine. You'll notice in this bottom image, we have an image of what says a mature cone ready for collection in the middle bottom. If you wait until a mature cone has already dried out and opened up and released its seeds, often you won't get maximum seed collection or even maximum seed quality. The best way to collect is to collect cones which are still green but immediately prior to them drying out and opening. If you set that green cone somewhere, if it's fully mature, that green cone will actually dry out on its own and it will split open and release its seeds, and then you get a much higher efficiency of harvesting a greater number of higher quality seeds. So cones are essentially a modified shoot or a modified stem bearing modified leaves. So when we look at the development, there are 2 different types of modified leaves born on a cone shoot. We have seed scales and bract scales. If I can draw your attention to the female strobilus that's immature, the image on the left in the top left corner, you'll notice that there is a seed scale and a bract scale. The seed scale actually bears the little um, pocket of tissue which will contain the ovule, which will develop into the seed. And then right underneath there, there's a bract scale. Um, I think it's valuable to point out the bract scales. A lot of people miss bract scales, but often they're very useful for identification. The bract scales sit right beneath the seed scales, and their function can really depend on the species. In some species, they just kind of stop developing after pollination occurs. So, like in pines, they don't typically become anything super noteworthy. Um, some species they might become fleshy and help attract maybe a bird seed disperser to eat the seed and disperse the seed. Sometimes they fuse to the bract scale completely, and sometimes they provide a protective role. One species that's native to Idaho that has a really prominent bract scale is the Douglas fir. And if we look at the cones, we can see that every kind of rounded seed scale has kind of a spiky bract scale right underneath it. And growing up as a little kid in Washington, I was taught to think of those bract scales as little mice, like the hind ends of little mice running to hide underneath the scales of the cone. And that's always stuck with me. They do kind of resemble the two legs and tail of a mouse running to hide underneath the scales. So we can see the seed scales, which are those kind of large, rounded, more woody um, bract, and then we get the bract scales, which are um, usually thinner and paperier and right underneath each seed scale. If we look at this image on the top again for a moment, we can see that after pollination, the ovules develop and mature into our seeds, and we can see that those seeds sit on top of each seed scale. In most conifers, we get two seeds produced on top of each seed scale. So you can kind of figure out how many seeds a cone would produce by counting the number of seed scales and then multiplying that by two. And if pollination was successful for all of the ovules within, if pollination and fertilization, I should say, were successful for all of the ovules within that cone, that'll give you an estimate of how many seeds that cone would contain. One unique feature that a lot of conifers native to North America and Idaho have are serotinous cones. This trait is called serotiny. Serotinous cones are those which will remain closed even after the seeds have matured. And the only thing that can convince them to open is extreme heat. So if we look at these two top images, we see these closed serotinous cones. They're fully developed, but they are refusing to open. But after a forest fire, we can see that the cone on the right is charred. After the extreme heat of a forest fire, as the environment cools down, then the cones will open. And this is a feature of the ponderosa, sorry, not the ponderosa pine, the lodgepole pine, which is a very common species in forests in Idaho. Lodgepole pines are a species which are fire adapted in some really unusual ways. Unlike species like ponderosa pine or Douglas fir, which have really thick fireproof bark, um, lodgepole pines don't really try to survive a fire. They basically have a strategy that involves regenerating very rapidly after a fire. And there's some logic to this. Once a forest fire has passed through, all of the competing vegetation has been removed, and you're getting sunlight directly on the forest floor. So there's no competition for light, which means these baby plants, they're not going to be shaded out. They're going to have they're going to be able to make lots of food because they're going to be able to do more photosynthesis, and they're more likely to grow successfully. In this bottom image, we can see a mature lodgepole pine forest in the far background. And then we can see this area which was clearly burned a number of years ago based on all of the standing dead trunks with charcoal, a charcoal surface. And you can see this dense stand of young lodgepole pines which have regenerated due to the serotinous cones of lodgepole pine shedding their seeds onto the bare soil immediately after a forest fire. So that's a really interesting adaptive trait that not just lodgepole pines have. There are other species of conifers that have that trait, mostly pines, which are adapted to areas which experience frequent forest fires. And in that regard, just one other thing I'd like to add about that, for species that have serotinous cones, often regular forest fires are required for that species to maintain a healthy population. Lodgepole pines have a productive lifespan for about 50 years. After the tree is about 50 years old, the tree starts to age and become sickly, and they stop producing cones, which open up on their own. The serotinous cones are really only produced by older trees, which are getting sick and are kind of in dying forests that kind of need to burn anyway. Um, and a lot of these trees will start dying, and then the more dead trees there are, the more fuel there is for a fire. So these trees actually in some cases will create the conditions required for a forest fire to occur in order to start basically create conditions where a forest fire is likely to spread rapidly, burn completely, and allow these old dying trees to open their serotinous cones and restart a new fresh generation of pine forest. So they're a fire dependent species. If they don't have fire regularly, their populations actually don't do as well. Gymnosperms are some of the first plants to produce seeds, and the seeds of gymnosperms are a little bit different than the seeds of flowering plants. They have some slightly different parts. I'm going to start kind of at the outside and try to follow the developmental processes that allow these seeds to develop. So the first feature of a gymnosperm seed we'll talk about is the seed coat. And the seed coat develops from a sac of maternal sporophyte tissue. So that means basically it's a sac of tissue that, in this case, maybe a pine tree makes. And within that sac, which is called the integument, and you can see that in this diagram in the top, within that sac, the sporophyte, the pine tree, produces a megaspore or a female spore. And that female spore is going to germinate and grow into the child of the pine tree, the megagametophyte or the female gametophyte. And the female gametophyte, the megagametophyte, she takes up most of the volume of space within the integument or within that seed coat. And what she's going to do, if we look at this image, she's going to produce a couple little compartments called archegonia. And within each archegonia, she is going to produce an egg cell. And those egg cells are going to wait to be pollinated. If we look at the pollen grains at the bottom that have entered the pine ovule, each one is a microgametophyte or a tiny male gametophyte plant. And what they're going to do is they're going to produce a pollen tube, and their sperm are going to swim down that, not literally swim, but they're going to travel down that, and they're going to meet the egg cell, and they're going to fertilize they're going to fertilize the egg cell. And that fertilized egg cell is going to be able to develop into the embryo or the baby plant. What happens next is really unusual. So unlike in flowering plants where the food for the plant develops from some kind of specialized cells, the food that is stored inside of a gymnosperm seed is called the nucellus, and it develops directly from the tissue of the megagametophyte or the female gametophyte, which developed inside the egg integument, the child of the sporophyte. So she is going to the megagametophyte. She's going to sacrifice herself and basically pump herself full of proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates, a bunch of food, in order to provide fuel for embryo growth during the germination process when that seed sprouts. Like I said, the embryo is developing from that fertilized egg cell. The egg cell is the child of the megagametophyte, but both the megagametophyte and the pollen grains, which are the microgametophytes, those are the children of the sporophyte generation. So what we're seeing is maybe this pine tree. Um, it has the integument inside of the on top of the cone um, seed scale. So on top of the seed scale, the pine tree produces an integument, which is a little sac. Within that sac, it produces a megaspore or a large um, female spore. That female spore germinates and grows into the megagametophyte or the female gametophyte. She produces a few eggs within some sacs. On the scales of a pollen cone, we produce some microspores. Those microspores will germinate and develop into microgametophytes or pollen grains. Those microgametophytes are able to blow on the wind into a female cone and enter the integument. And then they're able to release their sperm and basically mate with the egg cells, which were produced by the female gametophyte, and start embryo development. And that embryo is going to grow and become basically the new sporophyte. It's a baby plant and it will become a new pine tree. When we look at the parts of the embryo, I think this is valuable to understand, especially for when we talk about monocots and dicots later in our units about flowering plants. Um, when we look at the parts of the embryo, a lot of the major organ systems of a large mature sporophyte have actually already started to develop. The first is the radicle. This is the embryonic root, and when the seed germinates, that's typically the first part to break out of the seed coat and begin growth. And that makes sense. A plant needs to be able to absorb water and mineral nutrients before it can really keep its leaves and stems plump and full of water so that they can stand upright and do photosynthesis. Um, so the radicle is the little embryonic root, first part to burst out of the seed coat. Just above the radicle, we have the hypocotyl. Hypo means below, and cotyl is a reference to the cotyledons. So this basically means below cotyledons. We'll talk about cotyledons in just a second. This is the embryonic shoot below the cotyledons. So if we look at these germinating pine seeds in the bottom image, we can see that there's this reddish brown stalk or shoot, which is below the seed leaves or cotyledons. That's the hypocotyl. So basically the hypocotyl connects the radicle to the cotyledons or seed leaves. The cotyledons are the seed leaves. These are the very first leaves to do photosynthesis after germination. And you can see in the top image how they're all kind of tucked together, and in the bottom image how they've started to expand and separate. And those will be the first needles of these pines. Unlike the flowering plants, conifers can have numerous cotyledons. In flowering plants, we typically see either one or two cotyledons. In conifers, we can have 12 or more. Conifers aren't super picky about how many cotyledons they have. And that embryo, because the embryo is the child of the megagametophyte, the female gametophyte, and the microgametophyte, which is the male gametophyte, the embryo is a sporophyte already inside of the seed. And if it's able to successfully germinate, it will grow into a large, mature sporophyte or spore-producing plant, like a pine tree. Um, Gymnosperms are most frequently utilized, or I should say their highest value usage for people besides their beauty as landscape plants and as natural resources for forestry and wildlife is wood. A lot of gymnosperms, especially the conifers, are very, very good productive sources of wood. Many of them are very fast growing um, sources of timber. And we're kind of seeing a change here as we move into the gymnosperms because from our previous plants, because our previous plants like mosses and ferns are mostly not woody plants. Gymnosperms are mostly woody plants. I mean that most species are woody. They have um, trunks that have wood and branches that are woody. Um, and when we start talking about wood from an evolutionary perspective, it's very nice to know about lignin. You can see in the top right corner the chemical structure of lignin. Lignin is a really interesting molecule. It is the molecule that makes plant tissues woody. Without lignin, wood doesn't exist. I've got here a list of things that lignin does. It hardens and structurally reinforces our vascular tissues. Remember that our vascular tissues are those tubes which are moving water and sugars through the stems and roots and leaves. Um, Cellulose, which is what plants make their cell walls out of, it absorbs water, and that actually helps water stick to the inner lining of xylem tissues. Xylem is the water conducting tissue within a stem. Um, but because cellulose is hydrophilic or it loves water, water would just seep right through it um, if we didn't have lignin. Lignin is actually hydrophobic. It would repel water, kind of like waxes or oils. And so, because each each vessel of vascular tissue is enclosed in lignin, it means it's kind of like I want you to imagine a garden hose that's made out of fabric. Most cotton fabric is mostly cellulose by weight. So if you have a garden hose made of cotton fabric, it's going to be super leaky and inefficient. If we coat that cotton garden hose in um, like grease, right? Or maybe we coat it in plastic or wax. If we waxed the fabric, trying to move water through a waxed cotton garden hose would really improve the ability of that hose to transport water without leaking all over the place. So this was an important evolutionary event, the evolution of lignin, that allowed plants not only to make harder tissues, but also to improve the efficiency of water movement through the stem without water just leaking everywhere. Um, Lignins are also unusual because they're antimicrobial. You might notice that there are a lot of little six-sided hexagonal rings in the structure of lignin. Those are what are called phenol groups, and a lot of the phenol chemicals are very antimicrobial, and so it actually helps prevent bacteria and fungi from invading um, the wood and rotting it, which obviously is going to be important if you're going to be a long-lived plant. If you want that stem to last for a really long time, you need to be able to ensure that it's not going to decay. Um, the wood of gymnosperms is not really the same as the wood of flowering plants. So when we look at our broadleaf trees, all of our broadleaf trees are um, flowering plants. They're angiosperms. And the angiosperms have some xylem tissues, which are called vessel elements. If we look at this image in the bottom right-hand corner, those vessel elements are basically these larger tubes that have these perforated plates between each cell that allow the flow of really large amounts of water through the stem. Um, in the gymnosperms, these vessel elements are largely absent. None of the conifers have them. I think the only gymnosperms that do have them are some of the netum species, which we'll talk about later. Instead, the wood of gymnosperms is composed almost entirely of tracheids. And these tracheids are kind of like skinny, long, skinny, pointy cells with little what are called aerulated pits, and these pits allow water to flow sideways from one tracheid to the next. And so when you have lots of these in a series, you can actually move quite a lot of water up the trunk. Wood that's composed primarily of tracheids is lower density, which makes it a lot softer. And that's why we don't use conifer wood like pine to make things like hardwood floors or even furniture. a lot of softwood dings really, really easily, and we don't really want to be putting holes and dents in a hardwood floor. For example, if you walked on them with stiletto heels, you can imagine that the that hard stiletto heel has a lot of weight behind it, and that can dent the wood. Harder flowering plant wood, um, like maple or oak, is composed primarily of vessel elements, and it's a lot denser and it's a lot better for you making furniture and hardwood flooring. The wood of gymnosperms, because it has really good bending strength, it's a little bit more flexible. It's really good for construction. So a lot of our gymnosperm wood is used for things like framing houses. Typically around here would either be using pine or Douglas fir to frame your house, which is interesting. Okay, and that's probably been important in the evolution of our conifers, especially because they have to withstand the bending forces that snow imposes when they catch snow on their branches. But that's just a hypothesis. I don't know that that's true. Because gymnosperms were one of the very first groups of seed plants to evolve, they've been evolving for a really, really long time, and they now possess really significant diversity. We're going to talk through um, some of the other groups of gymnosperms. Often, when we talk about gymnosperms, the conifers get all the attention. And I don't think that's fair. I think that a lot of the other groups of gymnosperms are really, really interesting. Some of them are valuable economically in their own right. And we'll kind of walk through these different groups of gymnosperms. We'll talk about some of their similarities and some of their differences and some of their defining features. The first group I want to talk about are not true gymnosperms, but I feel it would be a shame to move on from our really early seed plants without mentioning them. These are the seed ferns, the Pteridospermatophyta, and the Pteridospermatophyta are a polyphyletic group. That means that it's not really a taxonomically valid group. It's a bunch of different evolutionary lineages or clades of multiple kind of different early seed plants. Um, we don't really know a lot about them because they're all extinct. There are no seed ferns which have survived to the present day, but they are well represented in the fossil record. Um, and here I provided an image of both a seed fern fossil, which shows one of the seed capsules on a leaflet, and then also an artist's reconstruction of what those seed-bearing fronds, fern fronds might have looked like. And I just think it's a really interesting group. Um, we don't know a lot about them because it's hard to learn a lot about a plant that no longer exists. So we're totally dependent on fossils. First group of true conifers, not conifers, sorry. First group of true gymnosperms that I'd like to talk about are the ginkgos. One of the things that's most interesting about ginkgos is that they have existed for a really long time. They're very well represented in the fossil record. And one of the species represented very well in the fossil record is still around today. So we can actually see that the fossils of this plant are practically identical to the living species. Um, the ginkgos are really interesting plants. So they're dioecious, which means that there are separate male and female trees. And because of that, this ends up being relevant in landscape design. The female trees produce a modified fleshy cone, and you can see that in the bottom left-hand corner. Um, and each cone basically has one scale, which envelops one seed, and it smells kind of like rotting fish when ripe. Some people say that it smells like other things. I've heard people say that they smell like baby diaper. I've heard people say it smells like things which are, not repeatable. Um, so it's just kind of an unusual feature. But you can imagine that if you had a street planted with um, ginkgo, that could be really, really stinky and unpleasant. So in landscaping, we tend to prefer to plant male trees. The most popular, well, the only living species of ginkgo is Ginkgo biloba, and it's originally from southwestern China, and it was thought to be extinct in the wild for a really, really long time. This is a tree which has been popular in cultivation in cities and gardens in East Asia for a very long time, and is now present in cultivation in temperate regions around the world. Um, there were some wild populations which were recently discovered. It's not super clear if these are truly wild populations or if they are descendants of escaped landscape plants. But one of the pieces of evidence that indicates that maybe they are a remnant wild population is that they've got much higher genetic diversity than the ones that are grown in landscapes, which would indicate that they're probably a wild population, because the landscape populations often you're selecting superior specimens that have all the traits we want, and then you're only kind of propagating seeds or cuttings or grafting from a very small number of more attractive parent plants. So the plants in cultivation tend to be less genetically diverse because we're picky about what they look like. The male trees are really popular landscape shade trees. In the fall, they've got this excellent gold yellow fall color, and you can see in this planted street how pretty that color is in the fall. They also have excellent disease resistance and excellent tolerance of urban conditions. So they tolerate poor, rocky soils without a lot of nutrients. They'll tolerate drought. They'll tolerate really high levels of pollution from automotive traffic that a lot of other tree species don't tolerate well, and they still look good even when they're dealing with pollution. Some of our other landscape species, if they live in really urban polluted conditions, the leaves will actually get poisoned by that, and they'll start to develop discolorations of the leaf tissue. And the ginkgos don't do that. They're just super, super, super tough. So ginkgos are a good one to know about for landscaping. You just want to keep in mind that you only want to plant the male trees because they don't produce these very, very stinky, messy kind of rotting fish smelling cones, which when people step on, they just get smashed into paste all over your sidewalks. The Netophyta are also called the netophytes. This is an interesting group of plants. So it's composed mostly of what we refer to as relict genera. And what we mean by that is that these are kind of relics of a bygone era. Extinction has been very, very frequent in the different branches of this um, kind of evolutionary or phylogenetic tree of gymnosperms. And so there aren't a lot of living plants that kind of bridge the differences between these different genera. They are all more closely related to each other than they are to any other plants genetically. But they don't really look that similar because a lot of the species that maybe looked like something in between, they went extinct. The first one is Welwitschia mirabilis. This is a plant which, as long as conditions are within the tolerances of the species, it can live basically forever. And it inhabits deserts in Namibia in Africa. And you can see that this plant at the top is really a bizarre looking plant. I've heard some people describe it as the ugliest plant that exists. Young plants basically have this plate in the middle, and on each end of the plate, they produce one kind of long leaf that just grows out continuously. And you can see that at the tips of the leaves in the back far right corner, that the ends of the leaves just eventually wear out and they dry out. But that's not a problem because Welwitschia just kind of continuously grows more leaf out from that plate. It's a really unusual way to grow. And then around its plate, it produces cones, and those cones can be pollinated and then produce seed. Our next genus of the only three genera that are in this group is Ephedra. There are about 74 species. They're found in deserts all around the world. There are some species from southern Europe and North Africa. There are some species in Asia. There are several species in the western United States. One of the common names of this genus is Mormon tea, and that's because, and that's relevant kind of historical botany from the Intermountain West region that we inhabit. Mormon pioneers used to make a tea out of the branches, the young tender green branches of this plant, and ephedra is actually the source of the chemical ephedrine, which was a very popular diet medication in the 80s and 90s. And ephedrine was actually banned for sale. It worked really well. People lost a lot of weight, but the reason they were losing weight is because ephedrine, this chemical produced by ephedra species, is very similar in its chemical structure to amphetamines, to methamphetamines. And so people who were taking ephedrine to lose weight were having heart attacks and excessive weight loss and other health problems because of some of those negative health effects that amphetamines cause. So I kind of think back and think how funny it would have been to watch Mormon pioneers kind of getting high on an amphetamine because ephedrine is structurally, chemically structurally, an amphetamine. Um, so that's a medication that's no longer legal, but we do have a much safer medication that was kind of originally designed to do the same thing, Sudafed, which has since become much more popular as a decongestant because it doesn't have the same properties as ephedrine. Our last genus within the netophytes, because there are only three, is Netum. And Netum includes about 50 species. These are mostly tropical trees, shrubs, and lianas, and they look a little bit different from a lot of the other gymnosperms because they do have kind of broad leaves. We do see broadleaves in welwitschia, and we also see broadleaves in ginkgo. Um, but Netum is unusual in a couple other ways. Netum species also are, some of them are pollinated by insects, and they'll actually produce little droplets of sugary fluid to attract pollinators to carry their pollen from one cone to another cone. And then the cones themselves also produce um, basically they're modified to become fleshy around the seeds. So they're not true fruits, but they do share some similarities with our flowering plants. The largest and probably the best known group of gymnosperms are the Pinophyta, which are also known as conifers. The word conifer means cone bearing. And I'm sure we're all familiar with conifers, but just to overview, these are typically trees or shrubs, and they almost always have needle or scale-like foliage. Um, and just like all gymnosperms, seeds are produced in strobili or cones. I actually want to talk about some of the families within this group because I think a lot of us, when we think about conifers, we just think of pines and we call everything a pine. And the truth is that not everything is a pine. And especially in horticulture, it's important to not call everything a pine because there are a lot of conifers which are used in landscaping which aren't pines, and you can't get the right tree if you call everything a pine. So I think it's valuable to be aware, especially from a landscape perspective, but certainly from a botanical one as well, that there's a lot more out there than just the pines. So we'll talk about these families in order, and I might briefly mention some of the notable genera within each of these families. Our first family is the Pinaceae. This is the pine family, and this family of trees, of trees and shrubs, is mostly confined to the northern hemisphere. So that would be Europe, northern Asia, and North America. And they typically possess needle-like leaves. If we look at some notable genera, we do have the pines, Pinus, and we see in the top left-hand corner the branches and cones of a bristlecone pine. One trait that the pines have that sets them apart from other conifers is that they produce their needles or their leaves in little bundles called fascicles. And there are different groups within the genus Pinus that produce different numbers of needles per bundle or per fascicle. So there's the red pine group, there's the white pine group, and there's the black pine group. And each of those groups within the Pinus genus um, has different numbers of needles. For example, all white pines have 5 needles per fascicle, which isn't the case in the red pines and the black pines. A lot of the black pines produce only 2 needles per fascicle. The spruces are the next notable genus on the list. If we look in the top right-hand corner, we can see a spruce. Spruces do not have needles in clusters called fascicles. They have needles that are borne singly on the stem, and they have cones which tend to face downward when they're mature. They also have much thinner seed scales in the cones than pines do. Pines typically have really thick, woody seed scales, and often they have this kind of hardened tab at the end with a spike. We don't see that in the spruces. The spruces tend to have kind of thinner scales that are softer, and they tend to point down. In the bottom left-hand corner, we have a fir. Firs tend to have singly borne needles that point upward. Typically, the needles are also pretty blunt. They're usually not pokey like they can be in the spruces or pines. And the female cones, the megastrobili, are really interesting because they tend to point up, and unusually, they actually disintegrate when they release their seeds. So it's really hard to collect the mature cones of firs because they shatter and shed not just the seeds, but also the scales of the cone when they're mature. If you look in the back of that bottom left image, you can actually see what look like these little brown sticks pointing upward. Those are the remnant central stalks of some old female cones or megastrobili which have shed all their seeds, but also all of their seed scales. And then the last image we got a picture of here is a Douglas fir cone in the bottom right-hand corner. And the Douglas firs, they're in the genus Pseudotsuga, and they have those really notable bract scales that look kind of like the hind end of a mouse running to hide underneath the seed scales. And that's a really common species in forests in Idaho. We have some other genera in this group as well. The larches, which are conifers which shed their needles in the fall. You guys might be aware of the tamarack. That's a species of larch, also called the western larch, that is native to Idaho as well. And then the hemlocks, like tsuga. For example, there's the eastern hemlock in the eastern United States. There's the western hemlock, Tsuga heterophylla on the west coast. And there are also some Asian species of hemlocks. And then cedrus are the true cedars. These are cedars with needles. There are several groups of plants which are called cedars. Not all of them are true cedars, but the true cedars are in the pine family. And they're most famous historically for being used in the construction of the Temple of Solomon in the Bible. And the beams were produced from the Lebanon cedar. Lebanon cedars were actually so over harvested from these mountain ranges in the Middle East in their native range that they're actually extremely rare in the wild today. But Lebanon cedars are gorgeous landscaping plants. They've got really beautiful branch structure. Our next family of conifers is the Cupressaceae. This is the cypress family. And this family of conifers is also mostly restricted to the northern hemisphere. Unlike Pinaceae, the Cupressaceae typically have small scale-like leaves. And in most of the genera, the cones are woody, like we'd expect. But in one, the junipers, the scales of their cones are actually fleshy. So if we look in this bottom uh, right-hand corner, we can see these blue, fleshy cones of junipers. And people call these juniper berries, but they're not true berries because they don't develop from a carpel, they develop from a cone. Um, and those juniper berries are a cone that has evolved to attract birds, which can eat the fleshy cone, and then they can defecate the seeds out elsewhere. And that's how junipers get their seeds from one place to another to disperse their offspring. Another thing that what they call juniper berries or juniper cones are used for is flavoring the liquor gin. Um, Gin is also called Genever, and that comes from a related root word from juniper. So gin, Genever, juniper, um, that's what it's flavored with. Some notable genera would include Cupressus, which are the true cypresses. In the top um, left-hand corner, we have the Arizona cypress. This is a wild specimen, but Arizona cypresses, if they get a little bit more water in a landscape, they have this really beautiful bluish colored foliage, and they're very, very drought tolerant. So they're great for xeriscape landscaping. Um, in the top right-hand corner, we have Chamaecyparis, the false cypresses. This is Chamaecyparis nucatensis, which is the Alaskan yellow cedar, also called the weeping cedar. And those are really beautiful, kind of structural and elegant, graceful landscaping plants. In the bottom left-hand corner, we have thuja, which are called arborvitae. They're also called the false cedars. Um, and you can see how they hold their little branchlets in these flat, kind of fan-like pattern. We have junipers, which we've already talked about, which have fleshy berry-like cones. There's some other species on this list that you might also recognize, like sequoia, which are the coast redwoods, metasequoia, which are dawn redwoods. Metasequoia are really unusual because they were actually discovered first as fossils and were presumed to be extinct. And then years later, it was discovered that a living population still existed in China. So that's an unusual species of plant that was actually discovered first as a fossil and then as a living species. Sequoia dendron are the giant sequoias, which are the largest trees in the world, belong to the family Cupressaceae. And taxodium are the bald cypress. This is a deciduous conifer. They actually shed their needles in the winter, and they're native to swamps in the American southeast, but they're actually surprisingly cold hardy and can be grown in landscapes far, far north of their native range. The Araucariaceae are, I think, an interesting family to look at. Most species cannot be grown outdoors in Idaho, but some of them are kind of on the edge of what might be able to survive here. So the family Araucariaceae, or the monkey puzzle family, I'll talk about why they're called monkey puzzles in a second. They come from the southern hemisphere. Um, they tend to be very, very large, and they possess these really highly organized whorled branches. And they also tend to produce extremely large cones. And this is where the term monkey puzzle comes in. Um, the seeds of many Araucariaceae species are very, very large, like multiple inches long, and they're very rich in oils and fats. And they're used similarly to pine nuts, so they're actually edible. People will harvest the cones and use them as food, but wildlife will as well. And many species have very kind of sharp, large scale-like leaves that would basically make it very, very challenging for a monkey to climb, or at least that's where the name comes from. Whether or not they're really challenging for monkeys to climb, I don't know if that's ever been evaluated, but they do have typically often kind of very sharp, um, scaly foliage. Another unique feature of this family is as the trees age, they will really cleanly shed those lower branches as those lower branches become old and shaded, which often leaves you with these very, very interesting looking mature trees. Some notable genera include Araucaria. That includes the monkey puzzle trees, which you can grow in maybe some wetter, slightly milder climates in like zone 8. So you can actually find monkey puzzle trees planted all over in like Portland and Seattle on the Pacific coast. This also includes the Norfolk Island pine, which is a very popular houseplant. Um, Another notable genus is Agathis, which is native to Australia, New Zealand, and some areas in Southeast Asia. And Willemia. Willemia is another really interesting species that was actually discovered first as a fossil and then later discovered that there was still a population of living trees that exist. Willemia pines are extremely endangered in the wild, and they're actually only found in one valley, one mountain valley in Australia. The location of the wild population of Willemia pines is actually kept a secret to prevent over tourism from potentially accidentally introducing infectious disease or pests, and also to prevent people from vandalizing or over harvesting seeds. Um, but conservationists did release a small number of seeds a number of years ago, and a lot of these trees, which people have started growing, have started to produce seed, and so they're often held in botanical collections. They need similar conditions for growth as the monkey puzzle trees, so you can grow them. I've seen them at the Tacoma Zoo, at the Point Defiance Zoo. They have multiple Willemia pines. That might be one of the closer areas you could find one. Um, I know that gardeners in Great Britain also sometimes grow them. It's a rainier, slightly warmer winter climate than here. So yeah, those are some interesting groups. I just think that's fascinating at whenever we have a species of conifer that's first discovered from a fossil and then only later discovered to still exist. That's happened a number of times, as with the Dawn redwood. Podocarpacei are not probably a group that you'll run into very often in the northern hemisphere. These are southern hemisphere and tropical conifers. Um, the flowering plants, because of their broad leaves and because of their fast growth rates, they really have taken over the tropics and driven most of the conifers into the higher latitudes, into the far north and the far south, where having kind of long needle-like foliage is helpful for growing in really cold or dry climates. Um, and the Podocarpacei is one of the only families of conifers which have really managed to fight their way and continue to survive well in the tropics. Um, Many of the species in this family produce a really interesting modified scale that kind of looks like a berry, and you can actually see the seed on the outside of that scale. They kind of got that bluish seed, and then the scale becomes fleshy, and that helps attract maybe a bird to eat that seed and disperse it. Um, the species that are popular in cultivation are typically used for hedging in warmer climates. I know that in parts of Australia, they're popular landscape plants, but mostly not growable in the colder regions of the United States. Um, the next family is Cyadopityaceae. This is a bit of a mouthful. This is the umbrella pine family. There's only one living species in this family. It's Cyadopitys verticillata, and this is called the Japanese umbrella pine, and it's endemic to Japan. It's only found in the wild in Japan, but it is popular in cultivation, has been spread around the world as an ornamental plant. You will occasionally find nurseries selling the Japanese umbrella pine. My understanding, and I might be wrong about this, but my understanding is that this species is maybe only barely winter hardy here. So it's not a species that I've ever recommended to for landscaping work around the Treasure Valley, but it is a very, very interesting looking tree. It's got a really interesting texture. It's got really attractive, stiff, shiny needles. And if you were able to plant it somewhere where it got some winter protection, maybe on the leeward side of a house where it's protected from the winter wind, maybe it would be able to do all right here. The Taxaceae, this is the yew family, and this is a family of northern hemisphere conifers. They typically have flattened needles, and often in the wild, they're found growing in the forest understory. They're often very shade tolerant, much more shade tolerant than most of our other conifers. And like some of the other conifers that we've seen, they have a modified berry-like cone scale. We can still see that they're gymnosperms or naked seed plants, though, because their seeds are still exposed to the outside environment. And you can see right inside the scale the seed sitting inside. Yews are really popular as hedging plants. A lot of the uh, European royalty and aristocrats would have yew labyrinths or yew hedge mazes planted on their estates. And we can see references to those tall yew hedges in a lot of popular culture novels or film. Um, One thing that is good to know about yews is that they produce a toxic chemical called taxine, And taxine is very, very dangerously toxic, even in really low quantities. And it's most highly concentrated in the seeds. My understanding, and please, I do not recommend that you eat the cones or berries of yews. My understanding is that the berries are technically edible, but there's so much risk of taxine contamination from the seeds that they are not recommended for gardens where children will be present. Um, in fact, the city of Boise has actually banned the planting of yews because there have been so many wildlife deaths. When deer come out of the foothills and are starving during the winter because nothing has any leaves, they will eat anything that has leaves because they're starving. And often they will eat yews and become lethally poisoned by the taxine. So, um, if you plan to do any landscaping in Boise, I would recommend steering away from the yews. But they are otherwise very handsome evergreen plants, which make a wonderful hedge. Our last group of gymnosperms, um, we've looked at the ginkgophyta, which are the ginkgos. We've looked at the netophyta, which are the netophytes. We've looked at the pinophyta, which are the conifers. Our last group will be the cycadophyta, which are typically referred to as cycads. The cycads look a lot like palms, but they are not palms. The palms are actually flowering plants in their angiosperms, they're flowering plants. Um, and the palms tend to have kind of thin leaves that are kind of similar to the texture of like grass. Cycad leaves are typically hard and rigid, and they're often highly waxy as either a mechanism to conserve water in a dry environment, or the wax helps them shed water in tropical rainforest environments. So that waxiness has actually helped them colonize both tropical rainforests, but also some drier kind of arid regions of the world. Um, they produce really large cones, and they're unusually for a conifer, sorry, for a gymnosperm, they're pollinated by insects. Cycads are also very, very slow growing. I had, well, actually have a sago palm, which is a species of cycad, and in 3 years, the stem has probably grown 3 inches. Each year, they only put on kind of one new whirl of fronds. And so they just take a very, very, very long time to grow, and they're very slow to reach maturity. Um, this is a group of plants that a lot of people haven't heard of, but there are quite a few species. There are about 300 species of living cycads found around the world. The highest species diversity, if I remember correctly, is concentrated in Mexico, South Africa, and then some of the tropical regions of Asia. Several species are over harvested in the wild. Some species have edible seeds. Some species are over harvested in the illegal smuggling trade of exotic ornamental plants, where they're poached from the wild and sold to people for a lot of money, even though they're endangered. And then some species are harvested for starch inside of their trunks. If you basically um, wash some of the toxic chemicals that the plant produces out of the trunk, you can actually um, consume some of the stem tissue as a source of bready starch. Obviously, that's not ideal because these are very slow growing plants and people are hungry. So, um, if you over harvest cycads, it takes them a really long time to recover and reestablish populations that are mature enough to sexually reproduce. Um, Several species are in pretty immediate danger of extinction with fewer than 100 individuals remaining in the wild. Anytime we've got a species with fewer than 100 individuals, there's a big risk that that species may not make it due to inbreeding depression. So it's essential to preserve all of the living individuals to prevent some of the damaging effects that inbreeding can have on the available genetics within that population. The sago palm is one of the most popular. I don't have a picture of a sago palm on this slide, but we do on the next slide. It's probably the most readily available cycads in cultivation. It's very popular as an ornamental plant, and it's also traditionally used as a source of starch in its native range. This top image here is showing a stand of sago palms in some kind of garden somewhere. Um, Cycads are really, really interesting. They are mostly pollinated by insects. And rather than use things like petals or nectar to attract insects, they do what's called push-pull pollination. So they're basically able to push and pull pollinators between the male and female cones in order to ensure pollination. Cycads, similarly to ginkgos, are dioecious, meaning that a certain plant is either a male plant or a female plant, meaning that a male plant only produces male pollen cones and a female plant only produces female seed cones. Usually, the pollinator is either a weevil or a species of thrips. Weevils are a type of beetle, and those insects often live their entire life cycle within the cones of the cycad. So those insects are typically living in the male pollen cone, and they're feeding on tissue in that male cone that is deliberately disposable. The cycad produces it specifically to be eaten by these beetles or weevils in order to attract them. And as these weevils feed on this tissue within the pollen cone, they become covered in pollen. What the cycad can then do is increase the temperature. They're actually able to, these are some of the few plants that are able to generate heat within their tissues. They're able to drive up the temperature of the male cone and also release some volatile chemicals, basically like um, these chemical odors or gases, which drive the weevils out of the male cone and into the female cones where they perform pollination. Then the temperature and the chemical concentration produced by the male cone decreases over the night, and the weevils will return to feeding on the male cone, and that's where they lay their eggs and where their larvae develop. So we're really seeing this push and pull during the day. The insects are feeding, laying eggs, and developing their larvae in the male cone. They're getting driven out of the male cone in the evening. They're spending the night in the female cone doing pollination, and then they're going back and forth from one to the other, which is really, really unusual. Um, the insect pollination, we could say that this is an example of convergent evolution with angiosperms, although the cycads are using very different mechanisms to accomplish insect pollination compared to the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. All right, so that is all for our lesson on gymnosperms. Be sure to review the notes if you need to, or go back and re-listen to portions of this video if it wasn't clear. And we will discuss this in class. Have an excellent day.